Hey everyone, welcome to this version of Scholar Talks. My name is Brandon. A lot of you know me. If you don't know me, then welcome, and it's nice to see you, even though I'm not really seeing you. But I want to introduce my colleague, David Miller, to you. He's from Mississippi College, and I'll let David talk a little bit more about his experiences in just a moment. But if you're not familiar with Scholar Talks, this is an opportunity for me to sit down with a person that I'll use the word expert, David. I know that creates some pretty high expectations, but sit down with an expert in literary texts and just talk about those texts and why those texts are important for teachers, and something that teachers can think about. And maybe it's a text they're familiar with, maybe it's a text they're not familiar with. I've always learned something new about text I thought I was really familiar with when I've had these conversations. So we walk through the same kinds of questions every time we do this, and David has thoughtfully and kindly walked through those questions himself and is ready to go with it. But David, go ahead. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So as Brandon said, I am David Miller. I teach at Mississippi College, which is a four-year college just outside of Jackson, Mississippi. We have a graduate program, a master's program. There's a doctoral program in our education department. So we're a medium-sized, small private university, and I have been there for 31 years. So a long time in the same area, in the same position. But I've been teaching everything from first-year students straight through graduate students. Brandon and I got to know each other because we worked together with the Advanced Placement Program. So I worked with Advanced Placement for almost 30 years, 28 years, before I stepped down from that position. So I don't know if I'm an expert, other than I've done this for a long time in the same direction. So maybe that makes me an expert. Maybe I avoid the potholes. Maybe I know where things are. But yeah, no, the fact that this is a scholar talk makes me feel good. I try to get my students to think of themselves as scholars. So a lot of times I will walk into the classroom and I'll say, "Good afternoon, scholars," or whatever. And I try to get them to think about that. So it's good for me to think about that too. So thanks for having me. This is going to be a great opportunity. So
Great. Yeah, this is just a really great opportunity to nerd out until we're very relaxed. David, I think, has maybe seen me in a t-shirt twice in my life. So it's great to just get to kick back and do this and relax a little bit. And David, you've just come fresh from teaching a spinning class. Was it
step aerobics?
Step aerobics.
Yeah, so step aerobics. So right. I am a cardio instructor. That's I say that's my lunch money job. But I got into doing it several years ago. I've been doing that for over 20 years as well. So yeah, I teach 3 step aerobics classes a week, and I just came from that earlier this evening. Got home, showered, changed, and sat down. So it's a nice balance for me. It's really important, I think, that as a scholar, that I also try to keep the other parts of my life balanced, right? So as a teacher, everybody knows, right? And it can sort of lead to this sort of single-minded set, right? And so I've consciously, over the last few years, tried to break that pattern, tried to keep myself active physically, partly because I need to for my health, but also partly because it's a great way to sort of go and forget about what I've been doing all day, forget about the issues that I'm facing at the university or whatever, and just do something physical. And I think that's a great opportunity for everybody. Like I know that it's an extra added thing, but even if it's 45 minutes to an hour where you can just go and be physical and not think about whatever it is you've been thinking about all day, it's a great opportunity. So yeah. I think it's been good for me.
I totally agree with that. And you know, I'm trying to stay active myself. The problem is I find myself sometimes when I'm being active, that's when I'm doing some of the most productive thinking about what I'm working on.
Yeah.
And I can't get it out of my head. So it's helpful in that way. So, yeah, that self-care is very important. Well, great. So thank you for getting home and everything and getting with us this evening. So you have chosen a text that many people,
Yeah.
I'd say most people in the United States, and I'd say most people around the world who know English know of
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
text, even if they
Yep.
haven't read the text. And so
Mhm.
you've chosen Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and I think it's wonderful that
Yeah.
you've chosen that, because it is such a book that everyone knows or thinks they know, but it's great to hear other people's perspectives, especially someone who's teaching it at the university level. So why was this your choice?
Well, part of it was when you asked me, this is the course I'm teaching. I'm teaching a course in British Romantics this particular semester. And so what I decided to do, this is what we call a period course in our curriculum, right? So we focus on the historical context and interactions with literature. And so to help my students to sort of ground themselves in that, I decided to use Frankenstein because I knew it was going to be a familiar text for many of them, right? Or at least a familiar story, right? Whether they'd read it or not. And we actually spent 3 weeks on the novel. It didn't take them that long to read it. We read it all at the beginning. And then over the class periods, we sort of grounded it in different aspects of the period, different historical issues of the period. And it was such an illuminating thing for me to come back to this novel. I haven't taught this course in a long time, and to come back to this novel, I hadn't taught it in a long time. And to be able to work through it with my students in this level has been a great experience and has changed my experience of the novel. So when you asked, I was like, oh, this is fresh. This is good for me. And I know that it's widely taught. That's the other thing. So when I was getting set up for the class, I was doing a little bit of research for it. And there's this great thing called Open Syllabus Project, which some of your listeners and viewers may know about, right? Which is attempting to sort of catalog what are the most popular texts in all different areas, not just in literature, but in business and economics and education, and who's being taught on the higher ed level. And they've cataloged at this point, I think it's 475,000 English literature syllabi from across the United States. And the top novel, right, it's actually third on the list behind a couple of the handbooks, but the top novel on the list is Frankenstein, right? 6,700 plus syllabi have Frankenstein, right? And when you think about all the possible literature choices, right, that's really remarkable. It beats out things like Paradise Lost and Canterbury Tales and all of that, right? So on the higher ed level, Frankenstein's the most taught text. I know it's widely taught in high school. And I also run into students all the time. I'd say about half of my students had never read the text before this year, right? But they know the Frankenstein story. This has a long shadow, right? It has a long cultural shadow across Great Britain and across the United States, right? For some reason, this novel and the story that it tells has a long shadow. Now, most of us are more familiar with, the movie version with Boris Karloff from the 1930s. And so, my students are familiar with that scene. They were expecting some of those scenes in the book, which didn't happen, of course. So that was fun too. But just to think about that long cultural shadow, right? Why is this particular text, right, originally published in 1818? Why is this still a text that we keep coming back to? Why do we keep teaching it? Why do students keep reading it? Why do film versions show up? Why is it such a cultural touchstone? It shows up in cartoons, it shows up in movies, it shows up in sitcoms, right? Versions of this story show up all the time, right? And I just find that fascinating. I think that question of why that happens, right? Why are we drawn to this book out of all of the possible stories, right? Why is it that this particular story by Mary Shelley is the one that we're pulled toward? So,
I mean, it's so fascinating to think that this book essentially by what today we would call a girl, a young woman.
Yeah, a young adult. It's a young adult, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the YA.
Yeah.
It's the equivalent of YA.
Right. Written, and yeah, I mean, she had a pedigree of, I mean, her family and her friends. She had a
absolutely right. So her family,
still,
her husband, and her friends, right?
Yeah, but still, she's had such the Wollstonecrafts and the Shelleys that have just their impact.
Yeah.
And to think about what this novel, the longevity of this novel, and I love the phrase that you used, the long cultural shadow. I think that is so significant to thinking about. If this is the most assigned novel at higher ed, according to those syllabi that you referred to, and we know, you and I have firsthand experience seeing the thousands of essays that students write about it, then just what that is, and this isn't a question so much as a statement, but just what that is saying about our values and how that text is shaping, but maybe also reflecting our values. It's fascinating.
Yeah. Oh, I think so. And so, one of the things that I always do with this text, and actually I do it with a lot of different texts that have monsters in them. And I'm using that word in quotation marks because, Shelley calls him a creature, and I want to respect that. But the cultural understanding is that he's a monster, and that I think there's an understanding that this is a monster story. I'm going to counter that a little bit later. I don't think this is a monster story. I don't think this is a horror story. I think something else is going on. But that word monster, right, comes from the root words to show. Monstrare comes from the same root words as demonstrate, right? So there's something about monsters generally that we're so attracted to, partly because they show us what we're afraid of, right, on some level. And so I think this book somehow shows us the things that we are afraid of, or that we feel like we should be afraid of. And it's not always the message that I think we think it is. Yeah. Anyway, I will say more about that in a little bit, maybe. But I do think that there's one of the things that's popular is that it keeps coming up, right? And I think for the 21st century, it's even more relevant, right? For lots and lots of reasons, right?
Yeah, and now we can talk about that, because you got me thinking about the etymology of a word creature, too, as it relates to create, and so we can talk more about that when we come back to the monster bit.
Yeah, it's in this book. That's why she called him a creature, right?
Yeah, I love it. Okay, great. All right, so really, I'm giddy about this. It's going to be fantastic. So let's come back to her for a moment and talk a little bit about her.
Yeah.
So what is the relationship? And a lot of teachers out there who know the book say, "Oh, well, I know the answer to all this," but I think it's worth reviewing and discussing a little bit about the relationship between the text and her and their context.
So that's one of these great parts of this novel, I think, right? There's so many pieces in the Romantic age that come with origin stories attached, right? So we might think about Coleridge's poem Kubla Khan, right? So he attaches an origin story, contextualizes that story for us, right? Wordsworth does the same thing with lyrical ballads. We get these origin stories that get attached in the Romantic age, and she does that in the preface to the later edition. It's not there in the original 1818 edition, but she does give us that story that she and Byron and Pollinari and other people are there in the chateau, and they decide to tell ghost stories, and then they decide to write ghost stories, and nobody really follows through except for her, right? That's the sort of story. And she says that her story came to her in a dream, right? That's her story. And again, that's a very romantic story, right? It's almost identical to Coleridge's story of Kubla Khan, right? Which is he's sleeping, he's in this opium dream, he dreams this dream, and then he's rudely interrupted, and he writes down these fragments, right?
So let's be real about this. This is essentially some upper middle class people who have gone away for the weekend, and they don't have Netflix, they don't have internet, they can't sit on their phones, so they need something to entertain themselves, and so they decide, hey, we're going to write some stories. Now Coleridge's
Right.
thing about the opium dream, that's probably a different story,
Yeah.
but similar, right? Right.
Well, but the same kind of story. And my point is, I guess, that I sort of take all of that with a grain of salt, right? I
Mhm.
think it is true. Like, I think that, yes, we have enough collaborative evidence that this actually happened. But I also think that that's a kind of romantic trope in and of itself. Like, she's putting herself into this idea that this is a dream, right? That this came to me and I wrote it, right? It's almost the way for an author to sort of distance herself from the text. You mentioned her pedigree, which I want to come back to that because, her father is William Godwin, great political philosopher, has a lot to say about pragmatism and some other things. Her mother is Mary Wollstonecraft. Again, a political agitator, writer, wrote a lot about education, specifically the education of women. She ends up married to Percy Bysshe Shelley, obviously a radical, gets kicked out of university for being an atheist, right? She's friends with Byron. She's friends with these people. But what's interesting about all of that group, so she's swimming in a kind of intellectual world, right? Her parents, particularly her father, her mother dies, of course, at birth, but she's swimming in this intellectual area with all these people. But she's the only one that writes this long form fiction. Her father has attempted this in Caleb Williams,
Oh, I didn't
which
know that.
in and of itself is an interesting take, right? It's an interesting novel, but it doesn't have the power that Frankenstein has. It has not been, right. It's not been culturalized the way this novel has. That's not the right word, but adopted by culture the way this novel has, right? So she's really the only one out of that whole group. Byron doesn't write fiction that much. Shelley doesn't, right? Mary Wollstonecraft doesn't. Her father attempts it, but he's really much more interested in political philosophy. And so she's the only one that sort of turns to fiction in this way. And what she creates, right, is almost a kind of comet, right? It's almost like, oh my gosh, like it's a one-off almost, right? She does do other fiction, but nothing ever of this power, right? And just manages in one fell swoop to do this thing, right? There's all sorts of questions biographically about, how much influence her husband has over the text, right? We know that between the initial edition in 1818 and the other editions is that he does have his hand in there, but we don't know how much and exactly what he's done. There's lots of scholarship for that. But she stands there sort of by herself, even in the midst of all of this, right? And the novel, in many ways, depending on how you read it, can be seen either as affirming some of those intellectual ideas that she's swimming in, right? Or as sort of calling them into question, right? So where does she really stand here, right? How is she really thinking, right?
That's where she really starts to engage that complexity that we'll come back to in just a moment.
Yeah.
These things that it's the question without the, I'm sorry, it's the answer without the question in a way. But go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
No, I was going to say, you were, one of the questions that I, you had posed to me and that are part of this, right, is, what do we not know? What do people not know about her? And I think one of the most interesting things about her is that 6 years before she does this novel, right, her father, now she's, again, a teenager at that point, right? Her father sends her away to live in this tiny little village in Scotland with this family who are dissenters, right? So that means that they're dissenting from the state church. They are political agitators, right? They happen to be friends with their father, who's a political radical, right? But he sends her to Scotland, presumably for her health, right? But while she's there, she apparently, comes up against all of these very radical ideas, right? Living in this family that is not her family, in that sense. And I think that that's another interesting dimension to this book, that it's not a book that is meant to frighten us because science is scary, for example, right? But it's a book that really gets into questions about human relationships, human power over other human beings, right? How we treat other human beings. This is really a book more about our response to each other than it is a book about a fear of science, right? So I see a lot of times that teachers will come at this book and the central question is, oh, should Victor have created the creature? Should he have done these experiments? Should he have not done these experiments? And I don't think that's the question of the book at all, right? I was sort of thinking about all of this and was reading some things, and I read a sort of interesting essay that said, really what we've got in Frankenstein is like a Black Mirror episode. It's really the next step in science, right? As far as Shelley's concerned, right? This is not fantastic, right? It's just the next step, right? So it's almost like 15 minutes into the future, this is what's happening, right? So I don't think she's saying that we shouldn't do this. I don't think that's what she's saying. I think what she's saying is we don't need to be afraid of science. We need to be afraid of the wrong kind of scientist, right? So Victor's problem is not that he creates the monster, right? Or the creature, right? Victor's problem is that he abandons the creature, that he doesn't take responsibility for the creature.
And that's what the creature itself, I'll gender the creature. The creature himself ruminates on that multiple times throughout the whole text. Why did he leave me? Why did he abandon me? When he meets him, why did you leave me? You left. Yeah. I love it. So this idea, David, it's hard to put these ideas into a nutshell, but this idea that with the analogy of Shelley's exile, I'll use that word, not you didn't use that word, but Shelley's exile to Scotland, this is about human relationships.
Yeah.
More so than
it's absolutely about human
scientific commentary.
It absolutely is, right? So I think that's it. So whether it's, biographically, if we think of it biographically, whether it's the death of her mother, right, that her father never really let her forget, right? Names her after her mother, right? Never ever lets her forget that. Or it's being sent to Scotland to live with these people that she doesn't know, right? She runs away, that very famous part of the story. She runs away with her husband while he's married to someone else, right? So there is this sense of abandonment and struggles for human relationships. The other way I like to think about this, and I know that I'm sensitive to this, but it's almost like Victor is what happens to somebody in STEM that doesn't have the arts, right? Somebody who's only going to pursue the science part of this, right? And has these sort of tunnel vision and doesn't ever step back and ask the human questions, right?
It's the humanities, right?
Victor,
that are missing there.
Right. No, it's exactly right. So he isolates himself. He only reads the sciences. He only conducts science, right? And when he's faced with this very human dilemma of, I have created life, what am I going to do with it? He abandons it. He doesn't know what to do with it, right? The other interesting part about this is all the way through the novel, after he does that, Victor says over and over again, oh, I shouldn't have done that. That was my fault. My fault was creating life. My fault was creating life. And I said to my students, Victor takes the blame, but he never takes the responsibility, right? He's trying to define his own crime, right? And he defines the wrong crime, right? He says, oh, I never should have done this. That's not the issue. The issue is you did it, but you didn't take responsibility for what you did, right? So you can take the blame all day long, but if you don't take responsibility, this is what happens. Things go out of control, right?
And I know we have to be careful to not take a work of fiction and biograph it directly with the author's life. That's dangerous. And I
I'm
know you're
not a
not suggesting
biographical
that. I just want to go ahead and lay that out there. Like, we need to be careful with that.
No,
But I've never
I'm
considered
yeah,
this text. I've never considered this text the
yeah,
way you're thinking of it. And that's exactly why I'm glad we're doing this, because the
yeah,
idea that, here, what you said about, Shelley's mother totally had me thinking about
yeah,
Elizabeth and why,
yeah. Oh yeah,
because sometimes I've
yeah.
wondered, why is Elizabeth there? Why does she, what's her role
Yep.
as a character really in the whole text? But we see how those kind of side characters, she's not a minor character, but she's not a major character.
Right.
Um,
Right.
it's a different discussion, but how
Yeah.
what happens to them can affect the larger narrative, just like what happens to her mother affects her larger narrative. But I'm doing exactly what I warned about not doing a moment ago.
Yeah.
Biographing the text.
So I'm not a big biographical scholar. I need to say that I'm not a big biographical scholar. I'm hesitant to do that. But what I am interested in is how the novel dialogues with history generally, right? So, I mean, she sort of forces us to do this, right? So the title page, if we go no farther than the title page of the 1818 edition, right? So the title of the novel is Frankenstein. Very famous subtitle, maybe the most famous subtitle in all of English letters, right? Which is the modern Prometheus, right? So most people come to that and they say, oh, Prometheus, stole fire for human beings and was punished for it. Victor is like that. He's given life and he's punished for it, that kind of thing. There's so much more to that Prometheus story, right? There's a whole narrative, right? So
Well,
why
and I
does
think my training as a classicist, like when I was studying that as an English major and a classics major, I was seeing the different layers to that, but I was still struggling with them because I was struggling to understand both of them as an undergrad. So yeah, keep going, please.
So the wonderful counter to that is that, so the question always arises is, why does Prometheus steal the fire? Right? No, it's a question nobody really asks if you don't know much about mythology, but it's an important question because human beings had fire, right, before Prometheus, right? He had already given them fire, right? So Prometheus in Greek mythology is the creator of human beings. He's one of the titans that is not consigned to Tartarus. Zeus says to him, okay, you and your brother can create the human beings, right? And so Prometheus creates the human beings. His brother gives out the qualities, the good qualities, to all of creation. And when he finally gets to the human beings, his brother doesn't have anything left, right, to give these last of the creation, the human beings. And so Prometheus does two things. One, he makes the human beings walk upright, unlike the other animals, and he gives them fire, right? But he's a Titan, so he still doesn't trust Zeus. And so he teaches the human beings to honor the gods. But when the human beings sacrifice, Prometheus fools Zeus, right, by taking the worst part of the sacrifice, the bones, and he rubs a lot of fat on them and he puts them in one pile. And he takes all the good meat and he scrunches it together in one pile and throws a hide over top of it. And then Zeus, okay, choose how you want, right? Because Zeus can only think in the moment, chooses the fatty pile of bones, right? And Prometheus gives the meat to human beings as protein, as substance, right? Zeus is infuriated, and that's why Zeus takes the fire back, right? So Zeus takes fire away, right? And that's why Prometheus has to go steal the fire from the sun to bring it back to human beings, right? So the whole point of that, as far as I can understand for Shelley, is not that Victor is stealing the fire. It's that Prometheus was a creator who cared for his creation, right? And so my students were like, well, why then is he the Prometheus? Why is Frankenstein the Prometheus? Well, he's the modern Prometheus. Mm-hmm. And we're right back to this problem of the difficulty in the book is not the science. The difficulty of the book is the scientist, right? Yeah. Victor's not doing what a Prometheus should do, right? and we're right there, right? Then we have that quote from Paradise Lost, which goes right back, right back into it, right? But again, in Milton's world, the Christian God in Paradise Lost takes care of creation, even though he's angry with creation, he takes care of creation. Victor's not,
Yep.
right? And then finally, she dedicates the whole thing to her dad, to William Godwin, right? And Godwin's great philosophy was that you needed to make choices, moral choices, based on what would create the most happiness for the most people, right? That was Godwin's theory, right? So Victor in the novel doesn't do that either, right? He pretends to partway through the book when he says, oh, I'm not going to create the companion because I'm afraid then that they'll destroy humanity. So I'm going to, he tries, he sort of dresses up that logic, but it doesn't work, right? So right there on the title page, we've got all of this grounding in cultural context. She's pointing our attention to Frankenstein and saying something's wrong with him. It's not wrong with the creature. Something's wrong with him. Yeah. And you mentioned Elizabeth. I mean, there's the most telling moment, right? Where he supposedly loves Elizabeth, right? He marries Elizabeth, right? And the monster has already said, the creature's already said to him, I'm going to be with you on your wedding night. Frankenstein never thinks of her, right? Cannot conceive that the monster is going to do anything except kill him.
Right. Yeah.
Right. I mean, there's the problem.
Yeah, I'm trying to be disciplined myself and not go off into more.
Yeah, no, I'm no.
Because it's right. Just so thick and there's so much. I do have to say, in all the talk about Prometheus and feel free to spin. This is more about you than me. Yeah, but in all the talk about Prometheus, I remember I was originally the first time I ever read the book as an undergraduate, and every time I've come back to it since then, I'm always taken by the scene where the monster encounters fire and
the first time,
the warmth of it, but then the naivety of burying his hand and thinking about Prometheus and of course for people who know that symbology and students might not, they may have to connect it and do that thinking about it, but what knowledge does to us, what those sorts of things do to us, and this is something that lots of people have made the connections to. But when I think about giving that fire back to man, what are you doing? I think about that too, and that's just another layer, another level of that Promethean myth here, I think.
Yeah, and it's again one of those things where we have a technology, if we think about fire as a technology, which can be helpful or harmful, right? It's not fire that's the problem, right? It's how we deal with fire. It's how we use it, how we,
Well, that brings me to the relationship of this text and this author to our modern context. I mean, what you just said makes me think about social media.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, take your pick, right? Where we do things and we create situations or we create stories or we create whatever, and we don't take care of it, right? We sort of blow things up and then walk away, right? And we might later on say, oh, I shouldn't have blown things up. Well, again, the problem is, are you taking the blame or are you taking the responsibility for this? Right, ultimately, right? I think one of the reasons why this book has such a long cultural history is that it sometimes gets dressed up as that horror story. We're afraid of things that go bump in the night. We're afraid of death. We're afraid of this kind of monstrous creature, right? But if you've read the novel, then you know that the creature is not what we're afraid of, right? He becomes a murderer. He becomes an evil creature because of the fact that he was abandoned, because the person who was supposed to be responsible for him, right? Which raises, all sorts of questions about how we treat certain sections of society, how we deal with social problems, not just in social media, but in larger contexts as well, right? And I think this novel has a lot of that in it. And people who then encounter the novel find a very different story than the 1930s Boris Karloff version, right? Yeah, I think there's so much going on there in terms of thinking about what it means to pursue knowledge. And I've talked about STEM before, but what it means to pursue knowledge without the human dimension, right? And just to pursue the sort of knowledge for the sake of knowledge, which Victor does on some level, is a problem, right? Shelley is always going to see isolation as an issue. And a lot of the romantics see that as well, right? So to be isolated is not a good thing, right?
And I mean, from the very beginning of the novel, when we, the setting, the Arctic, and the isolation of that.
Yeah. Well, and that's why and now we're into the layers of narration thing, right? Because that's, Shelley wants us to see that, right? So Shelley wants us to see these layers of interrelationship, right?
It's completely unnecessary. Walton. I mean, we could have gotten the novel. I hate to say this. I hate to assume this, but we could have gotten the novel without that. We could have gotten the story without
we could have
recounted. But
so she actually starts in chapter 5, right?
Say it again.
Yeah, she starts writing in chapter 5, right? So she starts writing actually with the creature sort of waking up, right? That's her start to the story, right? And the rest of it she constructs around it, right? But it's Walton who is self-educated, and education is a whole other issue in this book, right? Mary Shelley's mother is all about education, but so Walton is self-educated. He's on this journey of exploration. He's not sure why he's exploring, but he says to his sister, to whom he's writing these letters, look, I want a companion. I want somebody who can educate me, who can help me grow, right? So he has this longing for human connection. And fate, or providence, however you want to put it, dumps Victor Frankenstein into his lap, literally into his cabin. And he has to decide in the course of the story, is this the companion? Is this who I should be listening to, right? And that's the interesting moral dilemma. And people forget this too, but the monster story, the creature story that forms the core of the story, which is so emotional and so heart-wrenching, right? The story of fire, the story of the Lacey's, all of that. We forget that the evidence, right? Because we have to have evidence. We can't just buy the story. But the evidence of that is the letters that Felix and Safie have been writing back and forth to each other, right? So the monster has rescued the letters, and he gives the letters to Frankenstein and says, if you don't believe my story, here's the proof. Here's the proof. It's these letters between Felix and Safie, right? And so right there is that human relationship, right? It's Felix and Safie, these two characters which really don't even come into the novel except through the monster, through the creature, right? But it's that human relationship, which is a relationship which is interracial, it's between classes, it's all of these things, right, at the heart of this novel, right? The monster says to Frankenstein, here are the letters. Frankenstein says to Walton, here are the letters, right? Here are the letters. If you don't believe my story, here are the letters, right? And so we're constantly being drawn back to this idea that somehow human relationships, caring for one another across all of these boundaries, is what matters, right, in this novel.
Yeah, I mean, and that is really what is given credence by the epistolary nature of so much of the narrative. I mean, it's not Dracula, in that it's not completely, it's not completely epistolary, but it's pretty darn close. And I love what you're saying about it coming back to being about human relationships. Like, that's what we get when we get letters, especially in her context, when that's the way people communicated over time and space.
Yeah. Right. And of course, the person that he's writing to, Margaret Seville, right, his sister, right, again, that human connection. My students always love when they figure out that Margaret Seville's initials and Mary Shelley's initials are exactly the same. It's MWS, right? So on some level, she's written herself into the novel as the kind of receiver, right, of these letters from Walton.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you're right. I mean, that whole central narrative is coming in the form of a letter.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll admit to having said this to some people in the past, I could say, you could start at you said it, you could start reading this book at chapter 5 and get the main story. I've said the same thing about the exact same thing about Wuthering Heights. You could start at chapter 5, get past Nellie Dean, and still get the meat of what everybody knows to be Wuthering Heights, if you're familiar with it. Great. So you've already talked to us a little bit about what we shouldn't, what's easy to miss, or what people don't know necessarily about Mary Shelley and about the text and things. But what I'd kind of like to know is, and someone who's just having taught it, you may really have a good perspective on this. What is easy to miss or dismiss about the text, and why shouldn't we? It may be something we've already discussed or that's come up and you want to come back to.
Well, yeah, no, I think the easy thing to miss about this is just what we've been talking about, right? So we sort of see those layers of narration, right? And for me, there are 4, right? So there's that story that Shelley tells us in the preface, that they were in the chateau and they were telling the story, right? So there's one level, right? We have Walton's story and the relationship with his sister, right? We have Victor's story, which is embedded inside of that. And then we have the creature story, which is embedded inside of that. Nothing new there, right? Everybody who reads the novel sees that, right? But what I think we don't spend enough time talking about, and this is where the complexity for me comes in, right? Because we're so interested in getting to Victor and the creature, right? How these layers of narration rub up against each other, right? And that on some level, we have to see Shelley's situation in that chateau, where she's the only female among this conversation, at least how she presents it. She's not the only female in the house, but she's the only female in that conversation as she presents it, is rubbing up against the fact that Walton feels isolated on board the ship, right? Because he's educated and he's of a higher class than the other mariners, right? To how Victor self-isolates, right? And how the creature is forced into isolation. So you have these alternating layers of narration, right? Alternating, shifting sympathies as we go down through that make the whole thing incredibly complex. So it's not just to say, oh, there are 4 layers of narration. It's what those 4 layers of narration do when they start rubbing up against each other, right? And remember, complexity is just this idea that we have what appear to be 2 opposing points of view that somehow have to get reconciled in a paradoxical way, right?
I often describe it as a tension of some sort. There's
tension is great. I'm teaching Blake right now, and that's a great word for Blake, because Blake doesn't want to see things as opposites. He wants to see them in opposition, meaning they have to pull on each other.
I like that distinction. That's a nice distinction.
Yeah. No, and I think that's it. So it's obvious, but we don't talk about what the effect is, right? So what's the effect that we get these piles and piles and piles of text on top of each other, right down to the letters, right? To Felix and Safi's letters. How does that work? How does Shelley, as ultimately the author of all of this stuff, manage to manipulate us as readers so effectively through these layers of narration? All right. She's certainly not the first person who's tried the epistolatory novel. She's not the first person who's tried a creature book, right? These are common tropes that she's working with, but somehow at this moment, she is able to understand these complex layers of narration to tell a story, for sure. Yeah.
So you say that with, she's not the first one to do the monster story. She's not the first one to do the epistolary. She's not the first one. I mean, I can't remember the novel that some people, or Tranto or something, what people claim is the first Gothic novel, or
absolutely Tranto.
That's it. So she's not the first, but I mean, is this novel, is this the apex of that? I mean, is this the,
Oh,
do people today kind
no.
of see that as see that novel as the model for what a Gothic text should be, or the what a monster
Yeah.
or creature text should be?
Yeah, I think so, right? So I think, it's one of these moments in genre development, right? Which really sort of takes on all of these tropes, right? So it's the flowering of that, right? She's certainly going to have competition. There are going to be other Gothic novels. You mentioned Wuthering Heights. I mean, one way to understand Wuthering Heights is to read it as a Gothic novel. It's a very different Gothic novel from Frankenstein. Um, but nevertheless Gothic. So yeah, I think on some level, right, that's one of the things that sort of comes at a right moment at a right time. She manages to capture all of that. In the development of the novel, we are at that moment between the 18th and the 19th century when things are shifting, right? When we're getting more of the narrative, less of the epistolatory, right? Where we're turning our attention more and more toward potential fantasy, potential real creation, right? Yeah, I think there's all of that there, right? Um, I do this thing at the beginning where there are so many strands to this thing genre wise. There's at least 6 or 7 strands that she's picking up on, right? It's a novel of a journey, right? It's a epistolatory novel, as we talked about, right? It's a Gothic novel. It's all of these things that she's sort of pulling together. And they're hard to dissect because she's woven them all so tightly together, right? It's a journey novel in which nobody leaves, right? Because technically we're all within Walton's cabin, right? The novel never leaves that
Right.
space.
Right. The only
Right.
movement happens in the letters themselves,
Yeah, yeah.
or
In
we
the
are
and
taken
then
by the letters.
and the flashbacks, right? It's the flashbacks, but it's a locked room story in some level, right? It's Walton's having this intense experience, right? All locked in his cabin. So those are the kinds of things that I think are interesting. I think, you know, we talked a little bit about the history, but there's so much, I mean, there's so much you can do with this, right? So it's a novel that dialogues, that's the word I've been using in class, right? That it takes some of these things that are going on, the politics of the time, right? This is a novel which is framed by revolution, right? Whether it's the American Revolution or the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution is about to kick off. Like, I'm not the critic who pointed this out, but there's a whole essay about how nobody works in this novel. There's no industry. There's not even the peasants work in this novel. They're always partying, which is absolutely true, right? And so how do you write a novel at the beginning of the 19th century in which nobody works, right? And it's almost, and this is again the point that's made by this particular scholar, the scholar is saying it's almost so obvious by its absence, right? The fact that nobody is working, right, tells us how important work is going to be, right? Tells us how important this is going to be. So it's all of that. Theology, science we've touched on, philosophy we've touched on, art. This is all about the beautiful and the sublime, right? And what is beautiful? Victor rejects the creature. He says plainly, he rejects the creature because the creature is ugly, right? And my students pointed out again, as many students do, that as long as DeLacy can't see the creature, he thinks he's talking to another human being, right? So the voice, the mind that's coming across, because DeLacy's blind, he thinks he's talking to another human being. It's not until the children come in and see the creature that things go haywire, right? So what is there about our physical appearance that doesn't allow people to hear us, right? Or to see us as human, right? Again, Shelley keeps coming back to that point that Victor sees the monster as ugly, and that's why he runs away. He's horrified that he's created something awful, right? So I think there's all of that going on.
And
we've touched on education. These are all dialoguing. That's all very important.
And the idea of when you create a piece of art, and you let it go. It's no longer yours. It goes forth into the world, very much like what Victor has done. And, and then I think about, something like the isolation of the Arctic, but the expanse and the vastness of it, as it's described in the book, but then the isolation of that cabin that you mentioned and those men, and so, we've got variations on a theme here, the romantics, Shelley's Percy, Mr. Shelley. I think about Mont Blanc comes to mind, and the vastness, the beauty of that, but also the desolation of it. And so there's so many things that are coming into play here. It's just wonderful to think about it. And you've really got my mind going. I'm sure you've got people who are watching or listening, got their mind going with these things too. It just kind of strikes me, Austen publishes Northanger Abbey in 1817. And I hadn't thought about it until you said when this was published, which is 1818. And I just hadn't crossed my mind.
1818 is the first edition.
Yeah, right. And so, a lot of Austen's Northanger Abbey is often seen as kind of mocking that Gothic style. But here Shelley is,
immersed in it.
Right. Would that have played to her favor at the time, or how does that matter? Am I overthinking this concept?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point, right? Because Austen sort of stands back and she's making fun of it already, right? No, it's an incredibly popular genre, right? There's a reason why they sit around and tell ghost stories to each other. This is a very popular genre, right? And it's going to continue to be popular all the way through the 19th century, right? It never really dies down. And in fact, it doesn't, like in the United States, it doesn't die down. We still are intrigued by the Gothic / horror, right? Genre. And it really depends sort of on the particular moment in time, what form that takes, right? But I have a student right now who's interested in sort of history of vampires kind of thing, right? Which is another way of saying history of the Gothic novel for vampires, right? And we see it resurrecting itself, pun intended, maybe, periodically, right? It comes up, right? And the most recent iteration, started with Anne Rice, just died here a little while ago, but it started with Anne Rice again, right? With Interview with a Vampire. And out of Interview with a Vampire comes everything from light on, right? Now, certainly there are different qualities to that, but I think we've never really gotten away from this fact that there are monsters that need to show us what we're afraid of. And that inevitably the ones that capture our attention the most, and Frankenstein is one of these, are creatures that have something to do with death. We're never quite over that. So in that sense, like The Walking Dead and Fear of the Walking Dead is just another version of that, right? That we can't quite get over this idea of death as a kind of fundamental idea in the Gothic, right? It's part of our horror tropes.
And how many religions rely on
it's
not only some sort of resurrection or overcoming death, but the fact that you might find a way to live forever, or you might return from, not in a resurrection sense, in a reincarnation sense. And so it's all, so are you saying then, David, that the Gothic, or some of these Gothic tales, because not all Gothic is like that, but it's related.
Yeah, not all Gothic does.
It's so It is so enduring because it is so fundamentally human.
Yeah, I think that's it, right? I think that's good. So in the middle of all of this, I'm teaching Frankenstein over the last few weeks, and in my news feed, completely unprompted, start popping up these stories about Silicon Valley tycoons who are doing all of these wild, crazy science experiments in order to increase life longevity.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
It's a fountain of youth all over again.
Yeah, no, it is, right. And it's coming back to that. And I was like, well, here we go, right? This is exactly it. And I just keep coming back to where we've been sort of all night, which is this idea that it's not the science that we're afraid of, right? It's the fact that the science is somehow disconnected from what it means to be human.
Yeah.
Right. And so the Greeks taught us this, right? So the one Greek character who asks to be made immortal, right? And he's granted that request, but he's forgotten to ask for immortal youth. And so he just gets increasingly old and old and old until he finally turns into a cricket, right? And you're like, oh yeah, like I've got to remember some things about what it means to be human. Like right. When I deal with aging, when I deal with all of this, I've got to remember some things about what it means to be human. And I think it's just so easy to get caught up in technological advances. Like I'm a big tech person. I love tech. I love science. I'm all about CRISPR technology and DNA manipulation. I understand that, right? All of that. But I just keep coming back to this. Like Shelley warned us back in 1818 that we need to be careful that we're putting scientists in those offices, in those labs, which are human beings, and that they don't forget that they're human beings.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, the best example I think of is I saw a teacher, one of my teachers here a couple of years back, pull in an article while they were teaching Frankenstein. And this is very much about science, but the students did a really fine job of also making it about people, like you're saying, of the scientist, I believe he was from China, who had cloned not cloned. Sorry. You mentioned CRISPR, who had engineered the genes of
the DNA
of children to be resistant to certain diseases or something like that. You could Google this and find it. But the kids were brilliant. They were so quick to jump to say, well, it's not about the technology. It's about the scientist and what he did. He's the problem. And there were other kids in the same room, same discussion, who said, yeah, but once we've uncorked that bottle, once we've done this, and to pursue to our conversation earlier, about Prometheus, I could say, once we've opened Pandora's box.
Yes, which is the other part of that story, right?
Right. Yeah. So a lot of people are going to be going and rereading their Edith Hamilton or Googling.
It's worth it. It forms such a great basis to this, right?
Yeah, it does.
Because ultimately the only thing that's left in Pandora's jar is the one thing that could help us, right? It's the that does out, and that's hope.
Yep.
Right. Everything else comes out, but hope stays in, right? And it's a terribly dark moment in the myth, but there is that, and I don't think Shelley leaves us there. I should say this. I don't think Shelley leaves us there, right? So at the end of the novel, when the monster leaves and goes out against the ice, right? Walton is left alone again at the end. And it's one of the great unfinished moments, I think, in literature, right? Because it feels very satisfying. We know what happens to Victor. We know what happens to the monster. But what we don't know is what happens to Walton. Like, what's he going to do next?
Yeah.
Right? Is he going to go on contrary to the advice of his men, or is he going to turn back? And which should he do? That's really an important question, I think. Which should he do? Right? Should he pursue his own exploration against the wishes of his men who are mutinying? Right? Or should he turn back? Right? And I think that that's a great moment for discussion in the book, given everything that we've been reading about up until that moment.
And it's so easy to abandon Walton, because the narrative that people think of as the main narrative is I don't want to say wrapped up, but we've seen it leave. It's
we've
done.
seen the end of it. Yeah.
And so, but we begin with the end in mind there, thinking about, what does come of him? That's going to make me think about the ending of that novel a little bit differently now, David. Thank you for that. Yeah. This is what I'll think about when I'm working out tomorrow. This is what will be in my head.
Oh, there you go. That's good. That's a good thing.
That's right.
That's a
So
good thing.
great. So
Sure.
this has been a wonderful conversation. I think we could keep going for quite a while. I don't want to go too much longer though, because you've been so gracious with your time.
All good.
I do have one extra for you. We've talked to all these
Yeah.
things around the Gothic. So I'm just going to ask you,
Yeah.
we often hear about this romantic, Byronic hero. Is you laugh. I'm not even going to finish my question because I want to hear why you're laughing.
No, I frame the question. Frame the question.
I was just going to say, could you see Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein, as that kind of,
Right.
of hero? Because I've heard that argument before, and I don't know. I don't know how I feel about it, but I'd love to hear if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, I think so. The reason I was laughing is because it's like anything else it becomes this kind of trope, right? We start looking for it. And what I love about it is just, Byron was so instrumental in creating it, right?
Yeah.
He wanted to be that figure, right? And it is a kind of creation, right? He goes out of his way biographically to do that. And I feel deeply for Byron because, again, I think here's a man who just got caught in a whole bunch of stuff that he probably didn't have to get caught up in. But anyway, so can Victor be seen as that kind of Byronic hero? If we understand the Byronic hero to be the one who's isolated by his own genius, right? To his own detriment, right? To his own cost, right? So if we're thinking about Byron,
a la Heathcliff again in Wuthering Heights.
a la Heathcliff, I was going to do Manfred. Maybe some of the people might know Manfred, right? Which is Byron's closet drama, right? Mm-hmm. So there's some of that, right? If we look at that, right, and we say, here's a person who's isolated by his own genius and to his own detriment, right? That is a motif which is found across Romanticism, right? So that's one of the reasons why I find it, it's not a Byronic thing. It is this idea that we are alone. And the Romantics are desperately afraid that we're alone, right? And what they mean by we're alone is that we are trapped inside of our mind, right? So when we go from the 18th century, the end of the 18th century, we're just now beginning to deal with some of the philosophies of Descartes. We're just somehow dealing with this idea that everything we experience in our mind. And all of the Romantics, Wordsworth is afraid of this. Coleridge is afraid of this, that we are, in fact, as human beings, alone in our own mind, right? And the early Romantics, William Wordsworth, Dorothy Wordsworth, Coleridge, Leigh Hunt to a certain extent, those early Romantics hold out hope that the connection can be made, right? They really try for that. If we're thinking about this, we can think about the end of Tintern Abbey, where the poet turns to his sister in hopes that she's seeing the same thing that he is, but she's not, right? Or we can think about Kubla Khan, which I mentioned before, right? The poet is isolated, right? For he on honeydew hath fed and drunk the milk of paradise. Beware, beware, right? So we see this, but there's still this hope, right? That this could be overcome. By the time we get to Byron, Mary Shelley, Percy Bysshe Shelley, Keats, even to a certain extent, they're losing hope that that's possible. And Byron sort of embraces the opposite, right? It's nobody's ever going to understand me. I'm always going to be alone. I am isolated in my own intellect, right? And so we call it the Byronic hero just because Byron makes that most full expression of it, right? But it's all the way through. And it's another part of Frankenstein, right? The creature's isolated because nobody can look at him, nobody can feel him, right? And the person that should be able to love him as a parent loves a child can't stand him.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So thank you for entertaining that, because I've often heard that. I don't always know what I think about it. I see what you're saying about the creature, but I think it's something worth discussing, because I know lots of teachers like to think about those characters and how they work within those types of genre. So it's really important there. So before we finish up here, I want to give you the opportunity to come back to something you said earlier, and that was about the word monster, and talk just briefly about that. I know we've said a lot about the monster, but I think monster and the word creature even, because you got me thinking about that.
So, I mean, we could do a lot with this. My students struggle just with the naming, right? So popular culture tells us that Frankenstein is the monster, right? That's the name of the creature. But of course it's not. It's the name of the creature's creator. But this idea that this creature who should be created, right? Victor has literally created him, right? Who should be loved as a creation is loved, right? Is a monster, right? Because he shows us everything we're afraid of. He becomes a murderer. He becomes evil. He pursues Victor. Victor pursues him. They become locked in this kind of weird symbiosis, right? Where they can't quit each other, and they can't stand each other, right? So I think that idea of whether we call him the monster or whether we call him the creature is really important, right? Because Shelley insists on calling him a creature, right? And even though that word has come to us in the 21st century to mean something, not good necessarily, right? What is that creature? For her, it does carry with it that idea of creation, right? We've made him a monster. Culturally, we've made him a monster because he shows us what we're afraid of, right? Which is what happens when we die or when we don't die, right? And who turns into this kind of threat to society because he's a murderer, right? But I do think that difference between the monster and the creature are really important. And my students were helping me with that because I was using the terms interchangeably and they were sort of calling me on that, which I think is good.
Yeah. I mean, it just becomes, both terms have become such common parlance. It's hard not to use them interchangeably. But it's fascinating to make your students were being thoughtful enough about that after you having had that discussion with them to do that.
Yeah. They were the ones who started correcting themselves. And then, it was good.
And I always, when I think about the word creature, I'd never thought about the etymology of monster with my students, but thought about talking about the cognate of that word creature being create. And what is it that's being created here? And students really kind of went with that idea too. So I'm glad we were able to have that. So this is the point where we get to kind of talk a little bit about what are you reading, writing, researching now? What are you doing with your time?
Yeah.
Other than step classes.
Yeah, so I'm staying one step ahead of my students, right? So I'm dealing with a lot of things. No, my attention professionally has, this is going to sound weird in a debate about literature, but I think it's very instrumental. We're having a big and have been having a big discussion in higher ed about what does it mean to be a literature major and how does that play out in today's world in the 21st century, right? So I've really turned my attention in the last few years to working very practically at my university with a kind of thing that I'm calling majors to marketplace, right? So what does it mean to be a literature major? What are the skills? Because we're interested in skills. How do I get my students to recognize that? How do I get them to be able to talk about it, right? Because I think literature majors are valuable, not just because they can turn into English teachers, as important as that is, right? But because literature does add this dimension that we've been talking about all night long with Frankenstein, right? It brings this human dimension to this. I just did an alumni check-in with my seniors. My seniors have a senior seminar. I was with them this afternoon, and we had one of our alums from 2 or 3 years ago who Zoomed in to chat with us for about 20 minutes. He's working for an ecological firm in Florida that works up proposals for reclaiming soil, making sure the toxicity in soil is not damaging, those kinds of things, right? And he's a lit major, right, who went on to do this stuff. It's not technically quote unquote English, right? Not technically quote unquote literature, right? But the analytical skills that he learned, the narrative skills that he learned, right? And the ability to be human that he learned directly play into that. So I'm very interested in that. I'm really interested in helping my students sort of turn that corner, right? And to sort of bring back some of this understanding that the humanities are not this sort of esoteric something I pursue in my leisure when I have time, when the world's not burning, right?
Right.
I look at contemporary poets, and contemporary poets are some of the best people to show us this, right?
Yeah.
So here are people who could be involved in politics or could be involved in all these things, and they're writing very important works for us, right? Whether it's Clint Smith or whether it's Jericho Brown or some of these other people, Ellen Bass, all of these people who are writing such important works for us to think about. Richard Blanco, right? I could just go on with names.
Yeah.
But here are people who are making very important statements in literature, right? So that's another way in which literature is important, right? Yeah. Amanda Gorman, the inauguration poet, for example.
Well, I mean, you mentioned Clint Smith. I think about, I don't know if you saw the New York Times just recently. Clint Smith had a poem that was in the opinion section about book banning.
Okay.
And just wonderfully done. I encourage you to check it out. But
absolutely.
It's wonderful to think about how these English majors, humanities people exist as kind of to comment and observe the rest of the world. It's like I used to tell my philosophy students when I was teaching Introduction to Philosophy. They say, "Oh, I'm going to major in philosophy," and I'd say, "Well, you might not. I'd sure like to have a nursing major with or more chemistry majors with philosophy backgrounds, because sadly, the jobs for philosophers, there aren't many. I mean, if you want to pursue, I'm going to get a nasty email about this, but if you want to pursue academia, philosophy, go for it. But I would sure like there to be more businessmen or people involved in certain fields who have philosophy backgrounds or English or humanities backgrounds."
I want my CRISPR scientist to have read Frankenstein.
There you go.
Right? I would feel much better about CRISPR technology. That's right. If she's read Frankenstein, I think that would be awesome, right? But that's it. I think we've gotten so used to thinking about literature as an isolated field, and it's not an isolated field, right? It's a foundational field that goes across, right? And that doesn't make us better than everything else. It makes us foundational, right? And so we need to rethink, because we've been so solipsistic, right, in thinking that the point of literature was the preservation of literature, and it's not, right? It's the preservation of what makes us human, right? And that happens across disciplines.
Solipsism is exactly the right term. I'm so glad you used it. I could.
I really feel that.
Yeah. So, well, David, thank you again for agreeing to do this. It has been wonderful.
Always fun.
I forgot. Brandon. I was going to say, I'm reading right now. I am rereading Octavia Butler's The Parable of the Sower, and loving the reread. It's something I recommend, and something I think we're going to be talking about on a Scholar Talk sometime soon. So, I want to share mine too. But that having been said, thank you, David, so much for your time.
No problem.
I think
I've enjoyed it, Brandon.
Good.
Always good.
All right, everyone. And so thank you all for checking us out with these long form interviews about texts and about how those texts matter. Please feel free to be in touch, and I'll see you next time.